On the morning of September 28, 1901, in a small coastal town called Balangiga on the island of Samar in the Philippines, Filipino guerrillas launched a surprise attack on an American military garrison. Using machetes, bolos, and captured rifles, they killed 48 American soldiers in one of the most devastating defeats the U.S. military suffered during the Philippine-American War. The attack lasted less than an hour, but its consequences would echo for over a century. The American retaliation turned Samar into what one general called a howling wilderness, killing thousands of Filipino civilians and becoming one of the war's most notorious atrocities. Today, the Balangiga Bells that were taken as war trophies sit at the center of a historical controversy between the United States and the Philippines. But to understand why this attack happened, why it was so devastating, and why it still matters, you need to understand what was happening in Balangiga in the months before that September morning, what the American soldiers were doing there, and why the people of this small fishing town decided to risk everything in a desperate attack that they knew would bring terrible retribution. The Philippine-American War by September 1901 was not going the way American leaders had expected. The war had started in February 1899, when fighting broke out between American forces and Filipino revolutionaries who had been expecting American support for their independence. The U.S. military won the conventional phase of the war easily, defeating the organized Filipino army and capturing towns and cities across the archipelago. But victory in conventional battles didn't end the war. It just transformed it into something much more difficult. Filipino forces shifted to guerrilla warfare, avoiding direct confrontation with American troops, and instead launching ambushes, attacking supply lines, and then disappearing into the countryside where they had the support of the local population. By 1901, the war had become a grinding counterinsurgency campaign. American forces controlled the major cities and towns, but the countryside remained hostile. They occupied garrisons throughout the islands, trying to pacify their assigned areas and prevent guerrilla attacks. The soldiers, most of them volunteers who had expected a quick adventure, found themselves stuck in a frustrating war with no clear end. They were dying from tropical diseases, ambushed by guerrillas who knew the terrain, and facing a population that mostly refused to cooperate with them. The American strategy was to control the population, to separate the guerrillas from their base of support by forcing civilians into designated areas, destroying food supplies and livestock that might help the guerrillas, and using harsh tactics to intimidate the population into submission. Samar Island was one of the most difficult areas for American forces. The island is the third largest in the Philippines, covered with dense jungle and mountains, with a population that was fiercely resistant to foreign occupation. The people of Samar had fought against Spanish colonial rule for centuries, and they weren't about to accept American rule without a fight. Guerrilla bands operated throughout the island's interior, launching raids and then retreating into the jungle where American troops couldn't follow effectively. The coastal towns were nominally under American control, but even there, the population sympathized with and supported the guerrillas. Balangiga was a small town on the southern coast of Samar, a fishing and farming community of maybe 1,500 people. It had a church, a town plaza, some houses, and not much else. It wasn't strategically important. It wasn't a major port or commercial center. But in August 1901, the U.S. military decided to establish a garrison there as part of their effort to control the coastline and prevent guerrillas from moving freely. Company C of the 9th U.S. Infantry Regiment, consisting of 74 men commanded by Captain Thomas Connell, was sent to occupy Balangiga. From the moment they arrived, relations between the American soldiers and the townspeople were tense. The Americans immediately began implementing the same harsh policies that were being used across the Philippines. They confiscated weapons from the townspeople. They required work details from the male population, forcing men to clear trails through the jungle and work on military projects. They enforced a food policy that essentially sterilized the town, confiscating rice and other food supplies to prevent them from reaching the guerrillas, which meant the townspeople themselves often went hungry. They imposed a curfew and restricted movement in and out of the town. They conducted searches of homes looking for hidden weapons or evidence of guerrilla sympathies. Captain Connell was described by his own men as a martinet, obsessed with military discipline and order. He ran the garrison with strict rules and had little patience for what he saw as the lazy and treacherous nature of Filipinos. His soldiers, following his lead, treated the townspeople with contempt. They made demands. They took what they wanted. They insulted the population. There are accounts of soldiers making sexual advances toward Filipino women, though the extent of this is disputed. What's not disputed is that the Americans saw themselves as occupying a hostile town and treated the population accordingly. The work details were particularly resented. Filipino men, including the town's leaders, were forced to work long hours cutting trails through the jungle in the tropical heat. This wasn't just humiliating. It was physically exhausting and kept men away from their fields and fishing, threatening the town's food supply. The Americans justified this by saying the trails were needed for patrols to prevent guerrilla movements. But from the Filipino perspective, they were being forced to work for an occupying army that had no right to be there in the first place. Tensions came to a head in early September when Captain Connell, suspicious that weapons were hidden in the town, ordered a more aggressive search. He had his men round up all the adult males in the town and lock them in 2 large buildings. The men were held overnight, crowded together in unsanitary conditions, while the soldiers searched their homes. This was seen as a profound insult and violation. The fact that grown men, including the town's leading citizens, were treated like criminals and locked up like animals created enormous resentment. Even after the men were released and no significant weapons cache was found, the humiliation remained. What the Americans didn't know was that Balangiga was in contact with guerrilla forces operating in the interior of Samar. The guerrilla commander in the region was a man named Valeriano Abanador, who had been operating against American forces for months. The priest of Balangiga, Father Donato Gimbayolibot, was also sympathetic to the resistance, as were many Filipino priests who saw the American occupation as a threat to their authority and their faith. The town's leaders, including the police chief Valeriano Abanador, yes, the same person, he held both civilian and guerrilla positions, began planning an attack. The planning for the Balangiga attack was careful and clever. The Filipinos knew they couldn't defeat the Americans in a direct fight with inferior weapons. They needed surprise, overwhelming numbers at the point of attack, and they needed to neutralize the Americans' firepower advantage before the soldiers could use it. The plan they developed was to smuggle guerrillas into the town disguised as workers and mourners, to hide weapons where they could be quickly accessed, and to launch a coordinated surprise attack at a time when the American soldiers would be most vulnerable. The guerrillas began moving into Balangiga in small groups in the days before the attack. Some came disguised as women, wearing women's clothing and staying in houses. Others came as workers for the forced labor details. Still others came as mourners for a funeral, claiming to be relatives of someone who had died. The Americans noticed the increased population but didn't see it as suspicious. Filipino extended families were large, and it wasn't unusual for people to come from surrounding areas for funerals or festivals. What the Americans didn't realize was that these new arrivals were guerrilla fighters smuggling in weapons. The weapons were mostly machetes and bolos, which are large Filipino knives used for farming, similar to machetes but often with a different blade shape. These weren't firearms, but in close quarters they were devastatingly effective. The Filipinos hid bolos in caskets, in the church, under houses, in crates of supplies. They prepared these hiding places carefully, making sure weapons would be accessible when the attack came. They also identified where the Americans kept their rifles stacked, usually in the mess hall and in the barracks, and they planned to seize these rifles immediately to prevent the Americans from using them. The date chosen for the attack was September 28, 1901. This was a Saturday morning, the day the Americans usually held inspection and when they would be gathered together for breakfast. The timing was crucial. The attack would begin during breakfast, when most of the soldiers would be in the mess hall, unarmed, with their rifles stacked away. The guerrillas would have the element of surprise, superior numbers at the point of attack, and the Americans would be trapped in enclosed spaces where their advantages in discipline and firepower would be minimized. The morning of September 28 started like any other morning for Company C. The soldiers woke, did their morning routines, and gathered for breakfast around 6:30 in the morning. The mess hall, which was really just a large building they used for eating, was filling up with soldiers. Some men were still in the barracks. A few were on guard duty. The morning was quiet, with the normal sounds of a small coastal town waking up. The Americans had no idea what was about to happen. The signal for the attack was the ringing of the church bells. At approximately 6:45 in the morning, the bells of the Catholic Church in Balangiga began to ring. This wasn't unusual. Church bells rang regularly for various reasons, but this particular ringing was the signal the guerrillas had been waiting for. As soon as the bells started, Filipino men began emerging from houses throughout the town, grabbing bolos from their hiding places. Guerrillas who had been disguised as workers suddenly threw off their disguises and armed themselves. Within seconds, hundreds of armed Filipinos were rushing toward the American positions. The attack hit with overwhelming speed and violence. The first targets were the American sentries. Filipinos armed with bolos rushed the guards before they could fire their rifles or raise an alarm. The sentries were cut down immediately, hacked with machetes before they fully understood what was happening. With the sentries dead or dying, there was no warning for the soldiers in the mess hall. The main force of guerrillas, led by Valeriano Abanador and other leaders, rushed into the mess hall where most of Company C was eating breakfast. The Americans were sitting at tables, unarmed, their rifles stacked in the corner of the building. The attack was devastating. Filipinos swarmed into the building from multiple directions, swinging bolos, hacking at soldiers who barely had time to stand up. Men were cut down as they sat. Others tried to fight with their bare hands or grabbed whatever was at hand, plates, utensils, anything to defend themselves. But against men with machetes, unarmed soldiers had no chance. The scene in the mess hall was carnage. The Filipinos had spent months, even years, of frustration and anger, and they released it all in a frenzy of violence. They weren't just killing, they were mutilating. Men were hacked repeatedly even after they fell. The attack was personal and brutal in a way that conventional combat rarely is. This wasn't soldiers shooting at each other from a distance. This was close-quarters butchery with edged weapons. The Americans had done terrible things to Filipino civilians in other parts of the Philippines, had burned villages and used torture. And now Filipinos were taking revenge on these particular soldiers, who might not have personally done those things, but represented the occupation. Some American soldiers managed to fight back. A few reached the stacked rifles and began firing, creating a defensive position in one corner of the mess hall. Others grabbed bolos from dead or wounded attackers and fought hand to hand. Captain Connell, who had been in his quarters when the attack started, came running with his pistol and began shooting. But they were vastly outnumbered. For every American, there were 5 or 10 Filipinos, and the Filipinos had the advantage of surprise and momentum. The barracks was also attacked simultaneously. Soldiers who had been sleeping or getting dressed were caught completely unprepared. Filipinos broke in and began killing men in their bunks. Some soldiers tried to escape through windows and were cut down as they climbed out. Others barricaded themselves in rooms and tried to hold out, but the doors were smashed open and they were overwhelmed. The attack on the barracks was just as brutal as the attack on the mess hall. The few Americans who were outside when the attack started tried to organize a defense, but they were scattered and outnumbered. Some ran toward the beach, hoping to escape by water. Others tried to reach the church or other buildings where they might make a stand. But Filipinos were everywhere, cutting off escape routes, hunting down isolated soldiers. The town had become a killing ground for the Americans. The battle, if it can be called that, lasted about an hour. For the first 20 minutes, the Filipinos had almost complete dominance. They killed soldiers almost at will, overwhelming the Americans with numbers and the shock of the surprise attack. But gradually, the Americans who survived the initial assault began to organize. Small groups formed defensive positions, got their hands on rifles, and began firing in an organized way. The Filipinos, who were mostly armed with bolos and only a few old rifles, couldn't stand up to concentrated rifle fire. As American survivors concentrated their fire, the Filipino attack began to falter. Captain Connell, though wounded, managed to rally about 20 soldiers who fought their way to a more defensible position. These men, though outnumbered and scattered, were trained soldiers with modern rifles. They began to push back, creating a perimeter and laying down suppressing fire. The Filipinos, who had never intended this to be a prolonged battle, began to withdraw. They had achieved their main objectives, killing most of the garrison and capturing weapons and supplies. Staying to fight it out against the survivors, who were now organized and armed, would just lead to more casualties on their side. By mid-morning, the attack was over. The Filipinos withdrew from Balangiga, taking captured rifles, ammunition, and supplies with them. They faded back into the jungle, knowing that American reinforcements would soon arrive and that staying would be suicide. Behind them, they left a scene of devastation. Of the 74 men of Company C who had been stationed in Balangiga, 48 were dead or would die of their wounds. Another 22 were wounded, many seriously. Only 4 men were completely unscathed. It was one of the worst defeats American forces suffered in the entire Philippine-American War. An entire company had been effectively wiped out. The American survivors, wounded and traumatized, were in shock. They had been eating breakfast, and within minutes most of their comrades had been killed. The wounds from machete attacks were horrific: deep cuts, severed limbs, crushed skulls. The mess hall and barracks were soaked in blood. Bodies lay everywhere, many mutilated beyond easy recognition. The survivors knew they were still in danger. They had no idea if the Filipinos would return, if there were other guerrilla units nearby, if help was coming. They fortified what positions they could and waited. Help arrived the next day when another American unit reached Balangiga. The relief force found the survivors holding out, surrounded by their dead. The bodies of the American soldiers were gathered. The extent of the massacre became clear. The soldiers who arrived to relieve Balangiga were horrified by what they saw. Many of the dead had been badly mutilated. Some had dozens of machete wounds. The violence of the attack, the fact that it had happened during breakfast, the overwhelming nature of the surprise, all of it shocked the American military. News of the Balangiga massacre, as Americans immediately called it, spread rapidly through the U.S. forces in the Philippines and reached the United States within weeks. The reaction was fury and a demand for revenge. In the American narrative, this was a treacherous attack by savages who had violated the rules of civilized warfare. The Americans ignored the fact that they had been occupying the town against its will, that they had been imposing harsh measures on the population, that they had been conducting a brutal counterinsurgency campaign. In their view, they were legitimate authorities, and the attack was murder, not an act of war. General Jacob Smith was given command of operations on Samar with orders to pacify the island. Smith was 61 years old, a veteran of the Civil War and decades of Indian wars on the American frontier. He had fought at Wounded Knee, where U.S. troops had massacred Lakota Sioux. He brought to Samar the same attitudes and tactics that had been used against Native Americans, viewing the Filipino population as savages who needed to be taught a harsh lesson. Smith's orders to his subordinates were explicit and brutal. He wanted Samar turned into a howling wilderness. He told Major Littleton Waller, who would conduct much of the campaign, to kill and burn, and said the more killing and burning, the better it would please him. When Waller asked about prisoners, Smith said he wanted no prisoners. When asked about age limits, Smith reportedly said everyone over the age of 10 should be killed because anyone capable of bearing arms was an enemy. These orders were genocidal in their intent, aimed at destroying not just the guerrillas, but the entire population that supported them. The American retaliation on Samar was systematic and devastating. American troops swept through the interior of the island, burning villages, destroying crops, killing livestock, and executing civilians. The goal was to create conditions where guerrillas couldn't survive by destroying the food supply and the population that supported them. Entire communities were wiped out. Villages that had existed for centuries disappeared. The exact death toll will never be known, but estimates run into the thousands of civilians killed, with many more dying from starvation and disease after their homes and food supplies were destroyed. The campaign on Samar included numerous atrocities beyond even the harsh measures that were common elsewhere in the Philippines. There were massacres of civilians. There was torture to extract information about guerrilla locations. There was the water cure used routinely. There were summary executions of anyone suspected of supporting the guerrillas. There was deliberate destruction of the environment, with large areas deforested to deny cover to guerrillas. The campaign continued for months, long after organized resistance on Samar had been broken. The church bells of Balangiga were taken as war trophies. The Americans confiscated 3 large bells from the church, the same bells that had signaled the start of the attack. 2 of the bells were sent to F.E. Warren Air Force Base in Wyoming, and 1 was sent to a U.S. Army base in South Korea. For Filipinos, this was adding insult to injury, taking sacred objects from their church as trophies after massacring their people. The bells became a symbol of the Balangiga Massacre and the American retaliation, and their return became a persistent demand of the Philippine government for over a century. General Jacob Smith was eventually court-martialed for his orders on Samar, but not because the military thought what he did was wrong. He was court-martialed because his orders became public and created a scandal. Newspaper reports of his kill, everyone over 10 order reached the United States and provoked outrage from anti-imperialist groups. The military couldn't ignore the publicity. Smith was convicted, but his punishment was just forced retirement with full pension. He served no jail time. The message was clear. You could order mass killing of civilians, you could turn an entire island into a wasteland, and your punishment would be early retirement. The other officers who carried out Smith's orders faced no consequences at all. The Balangiga Massacre and the American retaliation raise profound questions about warfare, terrorism, and resistance. From the American perspective, Balangiga was a treacherous massacre of soldiers by terrorists who didn't fight by the rules. The Filipinos used deception, disguising guerrillas as civilians, and launched a surprise attack on men who were eating breakfast. They used weapons associated with barbarism rather than modern firearms. They mutilated the dead. In the American narrative, this justified harsh retaliation. From the Filipino perspective, Balangiga was a legitimate military operation by resistance fighters against an occupying force. The Americans were illegitimate occupiers who had no right to be in the Philippines in the first place. They were imposing harsh and humiliating conditions on the population. The guerrillas used the only tactics available to them against a better armed enemy: surprise and close-quarters combat. The fact that they used bolos rather than rifles didn't make the attack illegitimate. It just reflected the reality that they didn't have many rifles. In the Filipino narrative, the attack was a heroic act of resistance, and the American retaliation was the real atrocity, a genocidal campaign that killed thousands of civilians in response to the killing of soldiers in combat. Who's right? The answer depends on whether you accept the legitimacy of the American occupation. If the United States had a right to rule the Philippines, then Balangiga was terrorism, and the harsh response was justified, or at least understandable. If the United States had no right to rule the Philippines, then Balangiga was resistance, and the American retaliation was a war crime. International law at the time was ambiguous on these questions, and it remains complicated today. But certain things are clear regardless of perspective. The American occupation was imposed by force. The Filipinos didn't consent to it. And the retaliation against civilians on Samar, the deliberate killing of non-combatants, The destruction of villages and food supplies went far beyond any legitimate military necessity. The tactics used at Balangiga also raise questions about the ethics of surprise attacks and the use of deception. The guerrillas deceived the Americans by disguising fighters as civilians, by hiding weapons, by using a religious signal, the church bells, to coordinate the attack. These tactics are generally prohibited by modern laws of war, which require combatants to distinguish themselves from civilians and prohibit perfidy, the use of deception about one's status. But these laws were less developed in 1901, and they're often seen as rules that powerful nations impose to protect themselves while denying weaker opponents the tactics that might allow them to win. The guerrillas at Balangiga faced an impossible situation. If they wore uniforms and carried their weapons openly, they would be easily identified and killed by the superior American forces. If they tried to fight conventionally, they would lose. The only way they could fight effectively was through surprise and deception. Does that make their tactics illegitimate, or does it show the inherent inequality of rules of war that privilege conventional militaries over guerrilla forces? The question of proportionality is also crucial. Even if you accept that the Balangiga attack was illegitimate, does that justify the response? 48 American soldiers were killed in combat. In response, thousands of Filipino civilians were killed, entire communities destroyed, an island turned into a wasteland. Is that proportional? Is that justified? The Americans said yes, arguing that harsh measures were needed to prevent future attacks and to teach the Filipino population not to support guerrillas. But the principle that killing thousands of civilians is an acceptable response to the killing of dozens of soldiers is morally indefensible and would be clearly illegal under modern international law. The Balangiga attack also shows the limits of military occupation. The Americans controlled Balangiga in the sense that they had soldiers there and could enforce their orders during the day. But they didn't really control it. The population was hostile. The guerrillas could move in and out. Information flowed to the resistance, while the Americans remained ignorant of what was being planned literally around them. This is the fundamental problem of occupation. You can have military control without political legitimacy, and without legitimacy, control is always tenuous and requires constant force to maintain. The attack was possible because the entire town cooperated, or at least enough of the town cooperated, while others stayed silent. The guerrillas couldn't have smuggled fighters and weapons into Balangiga without townspeople knowing and helping, or at least not informing the Americans. The attack required detailed planning and coordination. The fact that this could happen shows how thoroughly the Americans had lost the population, how their harsh tactics had alienated even people who might have been neutral, driving them into supporting violent resistance. Captain Connell's role in creating the conditions for the attack is worth examining. His harsh treatment of the population, his arrogance, his contempt for Filipinos, his humiliating searches and work details, all of this created the resentment that made the attack possible. If the Americans had treated the population with respect, had tried to win hearts and minds rather than imposing control through force, would Balangiga have happened? Probably not in the same way. This doesn't justify the attack, but it shows how counterinsurgency strategies that rely on force and humiliation create the very resistance they're meant to suppress. The attack also shows the limits of military technology and firepower. The Americans had better weapons, better training, better everything by conventional military standards. But none of that mattered during the first 20 minutes of the attack when they were caught by surprise. Superior firepower only helps if you can bring it to bear, and surprise negates that advantage. This is a lesson that militaries seem to have to relearn constantly. That technological superiority doesn't guarantee victory against a determined enemy that uses unconventional tactics. The racial dimensions of Balangiga and its aftermath are impossible to ignore. The American soldiers in the Philippines saw Filipinos as racially inferior, as barely human. They used racist slurs constantly. They treated Filipino lives as worthless. This racism made it psychologically easier to implement harsh policies and to retaliate against civilians with genocidal violence. When General Smith said to kill everyone over 10, he could say that because he didn't see Filipinos as fully human. The racism that enabled lynching and segregation at home enabled massacre abroad. The Filipino perspective on race was more complex. They were resisting foreign domination, fighting for independence, but they were also influenced by their own racial and class hierarchies. The leaders of the resistance were often from the educated elite, who sometimes looked down on the common people they claimed to represent. The internal dynamics of Filipino society, the tensions between different regions and classes and ethnic groups, affected how the resistance operated and who participated. The role of the Catholic Church in Balangiga deserves attention. Father Gimbayolibot, the town priest, was involved in planning the attack. The church bells signaled the start of the attack. This shows how the Catholic Church in the Philippines, despite centuries of connection to Spanish colonialism, had become part of the nationalist resistance. Filipino priests saw the American occupation as a threat to their authority and to Filipino Catholic identity. They were often key figures in organizing resistance, using their positions in communities to coordinate guerrilla activities. The Americans, many of them Protestant, saw this as proof of Catholic treachery. Filipinos saw it as the church finally siding with the Filipino people. The aftermath of Balangiga affected how the war was conducted in other parts of the Philippines. The massacre shocked American forces and made them more paranoid about surprise attacks. It hardened attitudes and made harsh tactics more acceptable. If you asked an American soldier in late 1901 why it was necessary to torture prisoners or burn villages or shoot civilians, he might point to Balangiga as proof of Filipino treachery and savagery. The massacre became a justification for escalating brutality, a reason why harsh measures were necessary. This is how atrocities spiral in warfare, with each side using the other side's actions to justify its own violence. The long-term consequences of Balangiga extended beyond the immediate military campaign. The island of Samar was devastated. Its population was reduced by perhaps 20 or 30% from deaths and displacement. The social fabric was torn apart. Economic life was destroyed. It took decades for Samar to recover from the American retaliation. The memory of what happened became part of Filipino national identity, a story of resistance and martyrdom. Every Filipino schoolchild learns about Balangiga. It's commemorated with monuments. The town maintains a memorial to the attack and the retaliation. In the United States, Balangiga is mostly forgotten. Most Americans have never heard of it. It's not taught in schools. When it is mentioned, it's usually presented briefly as an attack on American troops without much context about the occupation or the retaliation. The bells taken as trophies sat at American military bases for over a century, and most Americans had no idea they were there or what they represented. This asymmetry of memory is telling. For Filipinos, Balangiga is a formative national event. For Americans, it's forgotten history. This reflects the different positions in the power structure. The Philippines experienced American colonialism. America just had one colony among several possessions. The legal and political battle over the Balangiga Bells continued for over a century. The Philippine government repeatedly requested their return, arguing they were cultural property that had been looted during wartime. American veterans groups opposed returning the bells, arguing they were legitimate war trophies honoring American soldiers who died. This position ignored the fact that the bells were sacred religious objects stolen from a church, and that the soldiers being honored had been occupying the Philippines against Filipino will. But for the veterans groups, returning the bells would be surrendering to terrorists who had killed American soldiers. The bells weren't returned until 2018, 117 years after they were taken. The return happened after years of diplomatic pressure, after the Cold War when the US needed good relations with the Philippines less, and after most of the American veterans who opposed return had died. When the bells finally came home to Balangiga, there were enormous celebrations. People wept. The bells were paraded through the streets. The return was seen as partial justice, a recognition that what had happened in 1901 was wrong, though it came far too late for anyone who had lived through those events. Understanding Balangiga requires understanding the nature of guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency. Guerrillas are weaker than conventional forces, so they use tactics that negate the stronger force's advantages. Surprise attacks, ambushes, deception, blending into the civilian population, these are the tools of the weak fighting the strong. Counterinsurgency forces face a dilemma. To defeat guerrillas, they need intelligence about guerrilla movements and support networks. Getting that intelligence often requires harsh measures, torture, punishment of civilians suspected of helping guerrillas, destruction of resources that might support guerrillas. But these harsh measures alienate the population, creating more guerrillas and more support for resistance. It's a vicious cycle that Balangiga illustrates perfectly. American harshness created the conditions for the attack. The attack led to even more extreme American harshness. That harshness created more resistance, and on it went. The only way to break this cycle is to win political legitimacy, to make the population believe that the government or occupying force is legitimate and worth supporting. But the United States never achieved that in the Philippines, at least not in the early years of occupation. They tried to win legitimacy through building schools and infrastructure, through promises of eventual self-government, through creating a Filipino elite that benefited from cooperation with American rule. These efforts had some success over decades, but in 1901, the occupation was still new and deeply resented, and no amount of schools could overcome the fundamental fact that the Philippines had been taken by force and was being held by force. Balangiga also shows the importance of intelligence in warfare. The Americans had almost no intelligence about what was happening in the town they occupied. They didn't know guerrillas were infiltrating. They didn't know weapons were being cached. They didn't know an attack was being planned. This wasn't because they weren't trying to gather intelligence. It was because the population wouldn't tell them anything. Everyone knew or suspected something was happening, but nobody informed the Americans. This is the intelligence nightmare of occupation and counterinsurgency. You can't distinguish between friend and enemy. The people you rely on for labor and services might be your enemies. The people who smile at you during the day might be planning to kill you. The tactical lessons of Balangiga were studied by the U.S. military and influenced how American forces conducted operations in later campaigns. The importance of security, even in apparently pacified areas, the danger of becoming complacent, the need for better intelligence, the risk of concentrating troops in vulnerable locations, all these lessons were written into training manuals. But somehow these lessons kept having to be relearned. American forces faced surprise attacks in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, attacks that showed the same pattern as Balangiga: patient planning by guerrillas, deception, surprise, overwhelming violence at the point of attack, and then withdrawal before reinforcements arrive. The question of how to remember Balangiga remains contested. Should it be remembered primarily as the attack on American soldiers, emphasizing the deaths of 48 men who were killed during breakfast? Or should it be remembered primarily as what happened afterward, the American retaliation that killed thousands? Should it be framed as terrorism or as resistance? The answer depends on your perspective and your politics, but any honest accounting has to include the full context. The Americans were occupying the Philippines against Filipino will. They were implementing harsh policies. The attack was brutal, but was a military operation against soldiers. The retaliation was genocidal, deliberately targeting civilians. All of this is part of the story. For the families of the American soldiers killed at Balangiga, the attack was a tragedy. Many of the dead were young men, barely out of their teens, who had enlisted seeking adventure and found death in a place they'd never heard of before being sent there. Their families received telegrams informing them their sons or husbands had been killed in the Philippines. Many of these families probably didn't even know where the Philippines were or why America was fighting there. Their grief was real and valid. The soldiers themselves were products of their time and their society. Most probably didn't think deeply about the morality of the occupation. They followed orders, did their jobs, and died violently far from home. For the people of Balangiga and Samar more broadly, the attack, and especially the retaliation, was catastrophic. Thousands died, communities were destroyed, families were torn apart, the social and economic fabric of the island was shattered. The survivors carried trauma that affected generations. Children who witnessed the American retaliation, who saw their villages burned and their relatives killed, grew up with those memories. They passed those stories to their children and grandchildren. The trauma of American occupation and the brutal retaliation for Balangiga became part of Samar's identity. Balangiga also influenced how other nations and peoples viewed the United States. Stories of the massacre, and especially the retaliation, spread throughout Asia. They reinforced perceptions of American racism and brutality. They complicated American claims to be different from European colonial powers, to be bringing freedom and democracy. When the United States criticized other nations for colonial abuses, those nations could point to Samar and ask what moral authority America had. The soft power costs of Balangiga and similar atrocities were enormous and lasting. The parallels to later American conflicts are striking. The village pacification programs in Vietnam looked a lot like what was done on Samar, forcibly relocating populations to deny guerrillas support. The use of torture in the War on Terror echoed the water cure used after Balangiga. The difficulty of fighting insurgencies in Iraq and Afghanistan repeated the same problems American forces faced in the Philippines. How do you fight an enemy that looks like the civilian population? How do you get intelligence when the population won't cooperate? How do you prevent surprise attacks? The U.S. military studied Balangiga and other Philippine-American War battles, but somehow the deeper lessons that occupation creates resistance, that harsh tactics backfire, that wars of choice in distant countries are hard to win, those lessons didn't stick. There's also a lesson about how military culture handles defeat and atrocity. The American military after Balangiga emphasized the courage of the soldiers who survived and fought back. They honored the dead. They used the massacre to justify harsh retaliation. What they didn't do was ask hard questions about why the soldiers were in Balangiga in the first place, whether the occupation was just, whether the policies being implemented created the conditions for the attack. Institutional cultures, including military cultures, protect themselves by controlling narratives. The narrative that made sense to the military was treacherous savages massacred brave American soldiers, which justifies harsh response. The narrative that might have led to different policies, American occupation created resistance which manifested in attack, which suggests occupation itself is the problem. That narrative was threatening to institutional interests and was suppressed. Balangiga should be taught in American schools as part of the Philippine-American War, which should itself be taught as a major event in American history rather than a forgotten footnote. Students should learn about the attack, about why it happened, about the retaliation, about the bells, about what it all meant. They should be encouraged to think critically about occupation and resistance, about the cycle of violence in counterinsurgency, about how racism enables atrocity, about the costs of empire. This doesn't mean condemning America or presenting a one-sided story. It means being honest about history in its full complexity. The town of Balangiga today is still a small coastal community. There's a memorial to the attack and the retaliation. The church, rebuilt after being destroyed in the American retaliation, stands in the town plaza. The bells that were finally returned in 2018 hang in the church tower. Tourists, mostly Filipino, visit to learn about the history. The town has struggled economically, like much of Samar, with many young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere. But the memory of 1901 remains strong, kept alive through commemorations and stories passed down through generations. The American soldiers who survived Balangiga went on with their lives, those who made it home. Some testified in the Senate hearings about atrocities in the Philippines. Some wrote memoirs, most probably tried to forget, to put the trauma behind them. The military officially honored them as heroes who survived a massacre, but the psychological reality was probably more complicated. They had seen their comrades butchered. They had been part of an occupation that led to that violence. They had participated in or witnessed the brutal retaliation. That's a lot of trauma and moral injury to carry. General Jacob Smith, who ordered the devastation of Samar, lived until 1918. After his court-martial and forced retirement, he lived quietly, largely avoiding public attention. His legacy is one of the darkest in American military history, a man who gave genocidal orders and carried them out. He represents how institutional position and authority can enable terrible evil, how ordinary people, Smith was described as grandfatherly in appearance, can order mass killing, and how systems protect such people from real accountability. The Filipino leaders of the Balangiga attack mostly escaped the American retaliation and continued fighting. Valeriano Abanador, who helped plan and lead the attack, evaded capture for years. He eventually surrendered when the war ended and lived into old age. He was treated as a hero by Filipinos, a man who had struck a blow against the occupiers. The contrast with how Americans viewed him as a treacherous terrorist shows how differently the two sides understood the conflict. Balangiga remains relevant today because the issues it raises haven't gone away. How should occupied populations resist? What tactics are legitimate in asymmetric warfare? How should powerful nations respond to attacks by insurgents? What are the limits of retaliation? How do we judge historical events where both sides committed violence? These aren't just historical questions. They're alive in current conflicts around the world. Understanding Balangiga helps us think about these questions with more nuance and historical awareness. The story of Balangiga is ultimately a tragedy with no clear heroes, just people making choices in impossible circumstances. The Filipino guerrillas who planned the attack were fighting for their homeland's freedom against an occupying army. They used the only tactics available to them and struck a significant blow. But the attack was brutal, and the use of deception by hiding among civilians would be considered a war crime today. The American soldiers who died were mostly young men following orders, occupying a country they didn't understand for reasons that were never clearly explained to them. They were victims of an imperial project they didn't create. The American military that retaliated committed undeniable atrocities, killing thousands of civilians in a campaign of deliberate devastation that would clearly be recognized as war crimes today. And the Filipino civilians of Samar were caught between all these forces, suffering the worst consequences of a conflict they didn't start. Remembering Balangiga means holding all of these truths at once. It means honoring the dead on all sides while being clear-eyed about what they were fighting for and how they fought. It means recognizing the legitimacy of Filipino resistance to American occupation while acknowledging the brutality of the attack. It means understanding why American soldiers reacted with fury while condemning the genocidal retaliation. It means seeing how empire corrupts both the colonizer and the colonized, creating cycles of violence that traumatize everyone involved. And it means learning the lessons that Balangiga teaches about the costs of occupation, about the nature of resistance, about the spirals of violence in counterinsurgency, and about why empires ultimately fail not through lack of military power, but through lack of legitimacy.